Look at the inside of your wrist right now. See that faint blue line running just under the skin? That's a vein, and right now, blood is moving through it at almost walking pace. You've probably never thought twice about what's actually inside that blood. But if a lab tested you today, there's a good chance a doctor would hand you a small card with 2 letters on it, O positive. It's the single most common blood type on the planet. And here's the strange part. For most of human history, nobody could explain why. It sounds like it should be simple. Blood is blood, right? But the truth is stranger than that. The reason type O exists at all comes down to one tiny missing piece of your DNA. And once scientists figured out what that missing piece actually does, they realized it explains everything from why blood transfusions almost killed people for 100 years, to why certain diseases have shaped entire populations, to a hidden loophole in your own blood that can trick even a modern hospital lab. By the end of this video, you're going to look at that blue vein in your wrist completely differently. Let's go back to the beginning, because this story does not start with type O. It starts with a mystery that killed people. In the year 1900, in Vienna, Austria, a young doctor named Karl Landsteiner was working in a lab, and he was frustrated. At the time, doctors had already figured out the basic idea of a blood transfusion. If a patient was bleeding out, in theory, you could take blood from a healthy person and put it into the sick person's body. It sounds like an obvious solution. But in practice, it was a gamble with someone's life. Sometimes the transfusion worked perfectly. The patient recovered. Other times, the same procedure, done the same way, killed the patient within minutes. Their blood would clump up inside their own veins. Doctors had no idea why the exact same treatment could either save a life or end one. Landsteiner didn't accept that this was just random bad luck. He started mixing blood samples from different people together in test tubes just to watch what happened. And he noticed something nobody had documented before. When he mixed blood from certain people, nothing happened. It stayed smooth and liquid, just like normal blood. But when he mixed blood from certain other combinations of people, the blood would clump together into solid little clusters, almost like curdled milk. That clumping is called agglutination, and it's actually your immune system attacking blood that it doesn't recognize as safe. Landsteiner realized that human blood wasn't one single substance. It came in different types, and mixing the wrong types together was exactly what had been killing transfusion patients for decades. He sorted the blood samples he was testing into 3 groups, which he labeled A, B, and C. That third group, C, would later get renamed to the letter we use today, O. A few years after that, other researchers found a 4th group, a combination type, which became AB. Landsteiner had just discovered the ABO blood group system, the same one written on your blood donor card today. In 1930, he won the Nobel Prize for it. But even after that discovery, one question sat unanswered for decades. What was actually different about A blood, B blood, and O blood at the level of the actual molecules? Landsteiner could see the effect. Nobody yet understood the cause. For a long time, people assumed blood type was just one of those randoms, biological facts like eye color that didn't really connect to anything bigger. Some assumed it was tied to personality. In parts of Japan, for example, a popular belief spread that your blood type predicts whether you're a natural leader or shy or a perfectionist, similar to how some cultures use zodiac signs. Others assumed blood type must line up neatly with ancestry, so that if you're type O, that alone tells you something specific about where your ancestors came from. And starting in the 1990s, a very popular book pushed the idea that each blood type came with its own ideal diet, claiming that type O people were basically built to eat meat like ancient hunters, while type A people were supposedly built to eat vegetables like ancient farmers. Well, all 3 of those beliefs sound tidy. All 3 of them are wrong, or at least far weaker than the popular version claims. And to understand why, we actually have to go down to the molecular level, into the machinery of a single gene. Here's the plain English version of what your blood type actually is. Picture the surface of every red blood cell in your body as a tiny factory floor covered in machine parts. Some of those parts are little sugar molecules sticking up out of the cell's surface called antigens. Your body treats these sugar markers the same way an airport treats a passport. If your immune system recognizes the markers as familiar, it lets the blood cell pass through without any trouble. If it doesn't recognize the markers, it treats them as an intruder and attacks. Almost everyone starts with the same base marker called the H antigen. Think of the H antigen as a plain blank keychain sitting on the surface of the blood cell. What happens next depends on a single gene called the ABO gene, which acts like an instruction manual for a tiny worker inside the cell. That worker is an enzyme, which is just a molecule whose entire job is to build or modify something else, the same way a factory worker's job is to attach a part onto a product moving down an assembly line. If you inherit the A version of that gene, the enzyme instructions tell the worker to grab a specific chemical piece and snap it onto the blank keychain, turning it into an A marker. If you inherit the B version, the enzyme snaps on a slightly different piece, creating a B marker. If you inherit one A version and one B version, both workers show up and both do their jobs. So you end up with a mix of A and B keychains side by side, which is blood type AB. Now here's the part that actually explains type O. The O version of that gene is broken. Not broken in some dramatic, harmful way. Broken in an extremely small, specific way. A tiny piece of genetic code is missing from the instructions, like a single sentence torn out of the middle of a recipe. Because of that missing piece, the worker enzyme never gets built correctly. It shows up to the factory floor, but it doesn't have the tool it needs to attach anything. So the keychain stays blank. It stays as that original, unmodified H antigen. That blank keychain is what defines type O blood. Type O isn't blood with some special ingredient added to it. It's blood where the modification step never happened at all. In a strange way, O blood is closer to the original default setting than A or B blood is. A and B are the versions where something extra got bolted on. O is the version where nothing did. This is also exactly why type O blood became known as the universal donor. Since an O blood cell doesn't have the A marker or the B marker sitting on its surface, a type A person's immune system doesn't see anything unfamiliar to attack, and neither does a type B person's immune system. The blank keychain doesn't trip any alarms. That single missing piece of genetic code, the same broken instruction that creates type O in the first place, is the exact reason O-negative blood can be given to almost anyone in an emergency, which is why hospitals guard their O-negative supply so carefully. So if type O is essentially the plain, unmodified version of blood, why did it end up being the most common type across huge parts of the world, instead of a rare leftover? This is where the story gets a lot more interesting, and where the myths start creeping in. You've probably heard some version of the blood type diet by now, even if you didn't know where it came from. The basic pitch, popularized starting in the 1990s, was that each blood type evolved during a different era of human history, and that your blood type diet should match whichever era supposedly shaped your ancestors. Type O was framed as the oldest blood type, tied to early hunter-gatherers. So type O people were told they were built to thrive on meat and protein and would struggle to digest grains. Type A was framed as showing up later once humans started farming. So type A people were told they needed a plant-based diet to match their supposedly agricultural biology. It's a compelling story because it turns something as ordinary as your blood type into a kind of ancestral destiny. That's exactly why it spread so widely. But when actual researchers went looking for evidence to support it, the pattern kept falling apart. Studies that tested people against the specific diet supposedly matched to their blood type consistently failed to find that people did better health-wise on their matching diet compared to any other diet. When people did see health improvements on one of these blood type diets, researchers found those improvements were explained by the diet itself being generally healthier overall, cutting down on processed food and added sugar, not by any actual match between blood type and biology. The ABO gene has no known verified connection to how efficiently your body digests protein, carbs, or fat. It builds a sugar marker on a blood cell. That's its job. It doesn't hand out dietary instructions. The personality version of the blood type myth falls apart the same way, just from a different angle. There is no known biological pathway connecting the ABO gene to personality traits, and large-scale studies looking for a real link between blood type and personality have not found one that holds up. The idea likely spread for the same reason astrology does. Humans are extremely good at finding meaningful feeling patterns in categories, even when the category itself, like blood type, has nothing to do with the outcome being predicted, like whether you're outgoing or shy. So here's the honest myth versus reality moment. Blood type is not destiny, it's not a diet plan, and it's not a personality test. But that doesn't mean blood type is meaningless, it's actually the opposite. Once you throw out the fake explanations, the real explanation turns out to be far bigger and far older than any diet book. To understand why type O became so common, we have to zoom out from one Vienna lab in 1900 and go back roughly 200,000 years. The ABO gene isn't unique to humans. Researchers have found versions of the same gene system in our closest relatives, including chimpanzees and other primates, and the variation shows up in a pattern that's older than our species itself. That means the split between A-type genetics, B-type genetics, and O-type genetics didn't start with modern humans deciding to evolve differently. It's a genetic fork in the road that existed in the ancestors we share with other primates millions of years before Homo sapiens ever walked the earth. In other words, type O isn't some recent shortcut evolution invented for modern life. It's an ancient, deeply conserved pattern that's been riding along in the primate genetic code for an extremely long time. Once early humans spread out of Africa and into different environments across the planet, all three versions of the gene, A, B, and O, kept getting passed down generation after generation. But they didn't stay at the same frequency everywhere. In some regions, one version became far more common than the others. And this is the part where the real science becomes more interesting than any myth about diets or personalities. The reason certain blood types became dominant in certain places very likely comes down to disease. Blood type doesn't just sit quietly on the surface of a red blood cell doing nothing. It turns out those little sugar markers can influence how easily certain diseases infect the body or how severely a person reacts once infected. Researchers studying malaria, a mosquito-borne disease that has shaped human history for thousands of years, have found associations between blood type and how severe an infection tends to become. Type O blood has repeatedly shown up in research as being linked to milder cases of severe malaria compared to type A blood in regions where the disease has been a major killer for generations. If a certain blood type gives even a slightly better chance of surviving a disease that has killed enormous numbers of people across entire regions and generations, that small survival edge adds up. Over hundreds of generations, in regions where a disease like malaria was a constant threat, people carrying the blood type with a survival advantage were simply more likely to live long enough to have children and pass that same blood type down to them. Multiply that pattern across enough centuries, and an entire population's blood type distribution can shift dramatically, purely from which version helped people survive long enough to reproduce. It's the same basic logic as a light switch that got left in a certain position generations ago because it happened to work better in a specific room, and every generation after just kept flipping it back to that same position without ever thinking about why. Nobody chose type O on purpose. Disease pressure quietly did the choosing, generation after generation, for thousands of years. And it isn't only malaria. Researchers have also studied a connection between blood type and cholera, a severe intestinal disease caused by bacteria, often spread through contaminated water. In that case, some research suggests the relationship flips, with certain evidence pointing toward type O blood being linked to more severe cholera symptoms in some populations, rather than a protective effect. That might sound like a contradiction, but it actually shows something important about how this whole system works. Blood type isn't a simple good type versus bad type scoreboard. It's a trade-off. A blood type that offers a slight survival edge against one disease in one region might offer no protection, or even a slight disadvantage against a completely different disease somewhere else. Which blood type ends up winning in a given region? Over thousands of years depends entirely on which diseases were actually present and how severely they struck the local population, generation after generation. This is also why you cannot look at a world map of blood type distribution and read it as a simple ranking, with one type crowned as universally superior. Type O is extremely common in large indigenous populations across Central and South America, and it's also common across large parts of West Africa. But the underlying reasons in each region likely trace back to that region's own specific disease history, not some universal advantage of type O everywhere on Earth. Meanwhile, type B shows up at higher frequencies in parts of Central and South Asia, again likely shaped by a completely different regional mix of diseases and history. None of this is a hierarchy. It's a set of local survival stories written into blood over thousands of years, each shaped by whatever pressures that specific population actually faced. Let's pause here, because this is the point where the human stakes of this story become impossible to ignore. This isn't just an abstract genetics lecture. Blood type has had direct life and death consequences throughout human history, and not only through disease resistance. Think back to Karl Landsteiner's discovery in 1900. Before doctors understood blood type incompatibility, transfusions were a coin flip between saving a life and ending one. Once Landsteiner's discovery became widely understood and adopted, doctors could finally test blood ahead of time and match donors to patients safely. That single piece of knowledge, rooted entirely in the ABO gene and its blank keychain type O variant, transformed transfusions from a terrifying gamble into one of modern medicine's most reliable, everyday procedures. Battlefield medics in wars fought after that discovery could save soldiers who would have died from blood loss just decades earlier. Surgeries that are now considered routine, including organ transplants, childbirth complications, and major operations, all depend on blood banks being able to sort and match blood type correctly, a system that exists directly because of what started as a strange clumping pattern in a Vienna lab more than a century ago. And type O carries an extra layer of importance in this story because of that universal donor status we mentioned earlier. In an emergency room, when there's no time to test a patient's blood type before a transfusion is needed immediately to keep them alive, O-negative blood is the type doctors reach for because it's compatible with the widest range of patients. Now, that means people who happen to carry type O negative blood are, in a very real sense, carrying blood that can save strangers they will never meet purely because of a tiny broken instruction inherited from their parents. It's a strange kind of biological inheritance. Not a disease, not a strength or weakness, just a structural quirk in a gene that happens to make your blood safer to share in a crisis. Now, here's where the story takes a genuinely surprising turn, a twist that even trained doctors sometimes get caught off guard by. Remember that blank keychain we talked about? The H antigen that sits underneath everything? The base structure that gets modified into an A marker or a B marker or stays untouched to create type O. There's an extremely rare condition where a person's body cannot build that base H antigen at all. It's called the Bombay phenotype, named after the Indian city where it was first identified in 1952. People with this condition have a completely different, separate genetic mutation, one affecting an earlier step in the process, before the ABO gene even gets involved. Without that base H antigen, their blood cells can't display an A marker, a B marker, or the standard O marker either, because the entire foundation those markers would normally be built on top of is simply missing. Here's why this creates such a dangerous blind spot. If you ran a standard blood test on someone with the Bombay phenotype, using the routine screening most labs use, their blood would often appear to react like type O, because it lacks A and B markers the same way normal type O blood does. But it isn't actually type O. And this is not just a technicality, it matters enormously in an emergency. A person with the Bombay phenotype cannot safely receive even standard type O blood, the blood normally considered safe for practically everyone, because their immune system will still recognize and attack that underlying H antigen that regular O blood cells display, the same H antigen their own body never learned to build. The only blood that's truly safe for a Bombay phenotype patient to receive is blood from another Bombay phenotype donor, which is exceptionally rare. In an emergency room without advanced testing, treating a Bombay phenotype patient as though they were an ordinary type O patient could be fatal. This condition is uncommon worldwide, but has been documented in relatively higher, though still rare numbers in parts of India, which is exactly why doctors in some regions specifically screen for it. It's a genuine loophole hiding inside a system most of us assume is completely straightforward. A reminder that even something as basic seeming as your blood type can have layers most people, and even some medical settings, never think to check for. So let's bring all this back together and be honest about exactly what we actually know and what we don't. We know that type O blood exists because of a specific, well-documented genetic mutation in the ABO gene, one that stops an enzyme from attaching a sugar marker onto red blood cells, leaving the underlying H antigen unmodified. We know this same gene system, in some form, predates modern humans by a wide margin, showing up in our primate relatives as well. We know that in various regions across the world, certain blood types, including type O, appear to have become more common partly because of the specific diseases that shape survival and reproduction in that particular region over thousands of years, with malaria being one of the more studied examples. We know type O plays a genuinely critical, life-saving role in modern medicine as the universal donor type. And we know that in extremely rare cases, like the Bombay phenotype, blood typing can hide a completely different story beneath a test result that looks perfectly ordinary on the surface. Here's what we don't know, or at least don't know with anywhere near the same confidence. Your blood type does not reliably predict your personality. It does not tell you which specific diet your body is supposedly built for. And it is not a meaningful stand-in for your broader ancestry or ethnic background on its own. Those are the popular myths that got attached to a real biological trait. Because the real trait, on its own, felt too quiet and technical to go viral. The actual science was sitting there the entire time. It just needed someone to translate it out of a research journal and into plain language. So think back to that vein in your wrist, the one you looked at right at the start of this video. Whatever type is written on your blood donor card, O, A, B, or AB, it's not some kind of ancient destiny written into your personality or your ideal diet. It's a molecular fingerprint of a specific survival story. One written by diseases your ancestors faced long before recorded history, by mutations that occurred millions of years before humans existed, and by a single missing instruction in one gene, one that just happens to leave that little marker on your blood cells, blank. If a mystery hiding quietly in your own blood, one doctor's only fully worked out relatively recently, is the kind of hidden story your DNA is already carrying, there's a lot more of it waiting to be uncovered. Subscribe, because the next hidden story might be written into a part of your body you've never once thought to question.